If you have ever received a letter from the Social Security Administration that said you were overpaid and read it 3 times without fully understanding what it was actually telling you about how much you owe, why you owe it, or what your options are, this video is for you. SSI overpayment notices are among the most confusing pieces of correspondence the SSA sends. They can reference large dollar amounts spanning years of payments, use terminology that is not explained in the letter itself, and arrive with repayment demands that feel immediate and absolute. Today we are going to go through exactly how SSI overpayment works, including what triggers an overpayment determination, what your repayment options are, and what rights you have when you receive one of these notices. In plain English, directly from the SSA's official program guidelines at ssa.gov. I am Andrew, and I have spent time going through the SSA's official SSI overpayment policies, the waiver and reconsideration procedures in the Program Operations Manual system, and the repayment rules that apply when the SSA determines a recipient received more than they were entitled to. Everything here comes directly from ssa.gov and the SSA's published overpayment and waiver guidelines. Before we get into this, if you find this kind of plain language explanation of Social Security and SSI rules useful, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week this channel covers one benefit topic in the same straightforward format, with no pressure and no alarm. Now let us get into exactly how SSI overpayment determinations work, what options are available to recipients who receive an overpayment notice, and what the SSA's own guidelines say about when repayment can be reduced, restructured, or waived entirely. The most common misunderstanding about SSI overpayment notices is that when the SSA sends one, the full amount stated in the letter must be repaid immediately and in full, with no room for negotiation, appeal, or adjustment. This misunderstanding is completely understandable because overpayment letters are written in formal legal language and are often accompanied by a repayment demand that reads as final and non-negotiable. For a recipient who depends on SSI, receiving a notice demanding repayment of tens of thousands of dollars can feel like an emergency with no options. But here is how it actually works. An SSI overpayment notice is the beginning of a process, not the end of one. The SSA's own guidelines provide 3 distinct options for recipients who receive overpayment notices: repayment, reconsideration to dispute whether the overpayment is accurate, and waiver to request that the SSA forgive all or part of the overpayment if repayment would cause financial hardship or if the recipient was not at fault for the overpayment occurring. All 3 options have formal procedures, specific timelines, and defined rights. We are going to go through each part of this in detail so that by the end of this video, you have a complete and accurate picture of every option available when an SSI overpayment notice arrives. To make this concrete, let me use an example. Consider someone like Chester. Chester is 64 years old, lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and worked for many years as a postal service mail carrier before a medical condition made it difficult to continue working. He has been receiving SSI for several years based on his limited income and resources. In the spring of 2026, Chester received a letter from the SSA stating that he had been overpaid $46,268 in SSI benefits over a period of several years. The letter stated this was because he had received a small inheritance from a relative that temporarily pushed his countable resources above the SSI limit, which he had not reported to the SSA within the required time frame. Chester believed he had no choice but to begin repaying the full $46,468 as the letter instructed, and that the SSA's determination was final. He did not know he had 60 days to request reconsideration if he believed the amount was incorrect, or that he could separately file a waiver request, asking the SSA to forgive the debt if repaying it would create financial hardship. Here is what was actually happening in Chester's situation. The $46,468 figure was the SSA's initial determination. Chester had the right to request reconsideration within 60 days, which would trigger a formal review of whether the overpayment amount was calculated correctly. He also had the right to file a waiver, arguing that repayment would deprive him of income needed for ordinary living expenses, and that he had not acted in bad faith when he failed to report the inheritance on time. This is not unusual. SSI recipients who receive large overpayment notices frequently have viable waiver or reconsideration options they are not aware of, and understanding the process changes the picture entirely. What causes an SSI overpayment and how it is calculated? Let us start with the foundation. An SSI overpayment occurs when the SSA determines that a recipient received more SSI than they were entitled to during a specific period. According to the SSA's Program Operations Manual system, overpayments can occur for several reasons: unreported income or resources that would have reduced the SSI payment, a change in living arrangements that was not reported, a period of ineligibility that was not identified in time, or an administrative error on the SSA's part. The SSA calculates the overpayment amount by going back through the recipient's payment history, determining what they should have received based on the correct information, and subtracting that figure from what they actually received. The resulting difference is the overpayment amount. In cases like Chester's, where a resource limit was exceeded for a period of months or years, the overpayment amount can accumulate into a large figure because SSI payments continued during the period when the recipient technically did not qualify. You might be wondering, what is the SSI resource limit that triggered Chester's overpayment? The answer is that the SSI program limits countable resources to $2,000 for an individual and $3,000 for a couple. An inheritance that pushed Chester's resources above $2,000, even temporarily, would have made him ineligible for SSI during any month in which his resources exceeded that limit. According to SSA Gov, the $2,000 individual resource limit has remained unchanged for many years, though certain types of resources such as a primary home, one vehicle, and certain retirement accounts are excluded from the countable resource calculation. The three options when you receive an SSI overpayment notice. Now that we understand how overpayments are calculated, we can look at the three options available to recipients who receive an overpayment notice. According to the SSA's overpayment guidelines at ssa.gov, every recipient who receives an overpayment notice has the right to repay the amount, request reconsideration to dispute the determination, or file a waiver to request forgiveness of the debt. This next part is where it gets more specific. Reconsideration is the appropriate option when a recipient believes the SSA's overpayment determination is factually incorrect. For example, if the overpayment amount was calculated using wrong income figures, if the period covered by the overpayment is inaccurate, or if resources that should have been excluded were counted. A request for reconsideration must be filed within 60 days of the date on the overpayment notice. During the reconsideration period, the SSA will not pursue collection of the overpayment while the review is pending, provided the recipient requests reconsideration on time. Waiver is the appropriate option when a recipient does not dispute the overpayment amount itself, but believes that repaying it would cause financial hardship, or that they were not at fault for the overpayment occurring. According to SSA Program Operations Manual System guidelines, a waiver request can be filed at any time. There is no 60-day deadline for waiver requests. The SSA evaluates two factors: whether the recipient was at fault for the overpayment and whether recovery of the overpayment would defeat the purpose of the SSI program or be against equity and good conscience. This applies in most cases. The exception involves situations where the SSA finds that the recipient intentionally concealed information that caused the overpayment. In those cases, the at-fault finding generally prevents a full waiver, though partial waivers or reduced repayment plans may still be available. In Chester's situation specifically, he had two potentially viable paths: a reconsideration to verify whether the $46,468 figure was correctly calculated across the relevant period, and a waiver request arguing that he was not willfully at fault, he had not understood the reporting requirement for inherited resources, and that repaying the full amount on his current SSI income would eliminate the funds he needs for rent, food, and medical expenses. Repayment plans, and how the SSA structures recovery. And finally, this is the piece that ties everything together. If neither reconsideration nor waiver is pursued, or if a waiver is only partially approved, the SSA will establish a repayment plan. According to SSA.gov, the standard SSA policy for recovering SSI overpayments from current recipients is to withhold a percentage of the monthly SSI benefit, typically 10% of the recipient's total monthly income, until the overpayment is repaid. For a recipient receiving the maximum individual SSI benefit of $967 per month in 2026, 10% would be approximately $96.70 withheld per month. You might be wondering, can I negotiate a lower monthly repayment amount if 10% is more than I can afford? The answer is yes. According to SSA guidelines, recipients can request a lower withholding rate if the standard 10% rate would cause financial hardship. The SSA can approve a reduced rate as low as 1% of the recipient's monthly income in cases of demonstrated hardship. This request is separate from a waiver. It is a repayment rate adjustment, not a forgiveness of the debt. For Chester, if his waiver was approved in full, the $46,468 debt would be forgiven, and no repayment would be required. If the waiver was approved partially, the remaining amount would be subject to a repayment plan at the negotiated rate. If the waiver was denied entirely, he would begin repayment at the standard or negotiated rate going forward. One thing worth understanding about SSI overpayments and their connection to Medicaid is that SSI eligibility in most states automatically confers Medicaid eligibility. An SSI overpayment determination does not by itself affect Medicaid coverage. The two programs are linked at the eligibility level. But an overpayment debt with the SSA does not trigger a Medicaid overpayment. This is not a warning, just something worth knowing so you have the complete picture if you rely on Medicaid for healthcare coverage alongside your SSI. Before we finish, let me answer 3 questions that come up most often about SSI overpayment notices. Question 1. How long do I have to respond to an SSI overpayment notice? Answer. You have 60 days from the date on the notice to request reconsideration if you want to dispute the overpayment amount or determination. For a waiver request, there is no deadline. You can file a waiver at any time, even after the repayment process has begun. However, filing a reconsideration within the 60-day window suspends collection while the review is pending, which is an important practical reason to file promptly if you believe the determination is incorrect. Question 2. What happens if I simply cannot afford to repay the overpayment at all? Answer. The SSA's waiver process is specifically designed for situations where repayment would cause hardship. If a waiver is filed and the SSA determines that recovery would defeat the purpose of the SSI program, meaning the recipient needs every dollar of their SSI to meet basic living expenses, the SSA can waive the entire overpayment. This is a formal determination, not automatic, and it requires documentation of your current income and expenses. Question 3. Can the SSA take money from my bank account to recover an SSI overpayment? Answer. The SSA's primary method for recovering SSI overpayments from current recipients is withholding from future SSI payments, not direct bank account garnishment. For former recipients who are no longer receiving SSI, the SSA can pursue other collection methods including Treasury offset, which can intercept federal tax refunds. If you are still receiving SSI, the standard recovery method is benefit withholding at the negotiated rate. Everything we covered today applies generally. But your specific overpayment situation, the amount, the time period, the reason, and your current income will determine which options are most applicable to you. The most reliable way to get your exact answer is ssa.gov, where the SSA's overpayment, waiver, and reconsideration forms and instructions are available, and your My Social Security account shows your current overpayment status if one has been recorded. For direct assistance with an overpayment notice, call the SSA at 1-800-772-1213 and ask specifically about your reconsideration and waiver options. Free legal aid organizations in your state can also provide guidance on SSI overpayment disputes. The Elder Care Locator at 1-800-677-1116 can connect you with local resources. For broader benefit questions, benefits.gov provides eligibility information across federal programs. These resources are free, they are official, and they will give you answers specific to your situation, not general answers like this video does. One factual note before we finish. The SSA communicates overpayment notices by mail, not by phone calls demanding immediate repayment, not by texts claiming your benefits will be suspended until a debt is paid, and not by emails asking for banking information to process a repayment. If you receive communication like that, it is not from the SSA. You can verify any SSA communication by calling 1-800-772-1213 directly. I am curious, was there a specific part of the SSI overpayment process, the reconsideration, the waiver, or the repayment plan options that you found most unclear before watching this? Leave it in the comments. The most common questions become future videos. That is how SSI overpayment works, including cases involving large dollar amounts like the $46,468 example we walked through, explained as clearly as I can put it. If something is still unclear, the comment section is open and I read every question. If this was useful, share it with someone who received an overpayment notice and did not know they had options. I am Andrew. I will see you in the next one.